As we get towards the end of the Mishnah of Eruvin, we have been creeping along, we've been changing subject in a creeping fashion. Some people would say, in England, they say segue, when you shift sideways from subject to subject. And we, in the beginning of this last chapter, we were talking about public and private and maybe moving something in a private domain from a public domain or vice versa, putting a hand from one domain to the other. And from that discussion, we got into keys, locks. What if you stretched out your hand and locked something? And from keys, we got into bolts. What if you bolt something? And we talked most recently in the last Mishnah about a bolt that had an enormous knob on the end that was more like a pestle, more like something that you would use for grinding spices. So if the knob is also a spice grinder, can you use that on Shabbat to lock a door? That's where we close with the last Mishnah. And now we're going to carry on the discussion about bolts. We're going to enter a completely new subject, and this is the topic on which the Mishnah will close. We're going to talk about how we use bolts in the temple. So we're going to segue from bolts to bolts in the temple, and that will allow us then to segue in general into things that we do in the temple on Shabbat, or generally things that we do in the temple. And it's very interesting that the Mishnah is being written 130 years after the temple is destroyed. So these are all memories from the point of view of the rabbis. But what they want to remember as they are closing the Mishnah of Shabbat, which of course is a masechet which applies both in the temple and outside the temple. It's universal. It's universal throughout the Jewish people. Seems that what they want to remember as they're closing the Mishnah of Shabbat is the Beit Mikdash, is the temple. And we'll see how little by little, almost without knowing it, the Mishnah draws us into that discussion. But we have to start to get there. We need to go with the bolts. So yesterday we were looking at bolts that might also be spice grinders. Now we're going to look at a bolt that drags along the ground. In other words, a bolt that drags along the ground. In other words, a bolt that is not necessarily fixed to the door. So when we slide the bolt in to shut the door, we're adding something to the building. We're actually mounting the bolt on the door frame. Maybe that's building. Maybe, we'll have a discussion as to whether that really is building or not. But that's the issue with a bolt that isn't really attached to the door, but just drags along the ground. Maybe it's tied to the door. Neger, hanigrar, a bolt that is dragged. Na'alim bo bamidash, avalo bam. I'm sorry, there's a word missing in this Sefaria text. A bolt that drags along the ground could be used to lock in the temple, but not in the country. Ve hamunach kan v'chan asur. And one that rests on the ground is forbidden in both places. As if to say, this bolt that rests on the ground isn't attached to the door at all. It's just sitting there on the ground waiting for someone to pick it up and shut the door with it. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to be more lenient, and we'll see in the coming Mishnayot that he's consistently more lenient. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, hamunach mutar b'mikdash v'hanigrar b'medina. As far as he's concerned, as far as Rabbi Yehuda is concerned, hamunach mutar b'mikdash, something which is just completely detached but lying on the ground. In other words, the extreme case, the one that's forbidden in both places, according to the first opinion, that is actually permitted in the temple. And in general, we have a rule that rabbinic prohibitions do not apply in the temple. So Rabbi Yehuda would say, look, it's a rabbinic prohibition to pick up the bolt that's on the ground and shove it into the door. I think he would probably say that adding a bolt to a door is not really building. And one that drags on the ground, vehanigrar, but medina, the one that drags on the ground is permitted in the country. In other words, the one that sits on the ground is not permitted, but the one that drags on the ground, well, it's pretty much connected to that door anyway. So it's permitted in the country. Let's have a look at the next Mishnah, which is a mirror image. Machzirin tzir hatachton b'mikdash aval lo v'amida. We replace the lower hinge in the temple, but not in the country. This is a door which is hooked onto two hinges. And in the old days, I'm sorry, I spent a bit of time looking for a photograph of this, but I couldn't find a photograph. If you look at an Islamic door, you'll see the door is connected to pins on the top, on the bottom, and the pins just slot into sockets. And so the act of effectively mounting the hinge, is the act of just slotting the pin into the socket, up and down. It's not like screwing a hinge in as we would do today on a wooden door. And it can fall out. So maybe if it falls out, we need to put it back. Now, of these two hinges, in the view of the Mishnah anyway, the lower one is not really crucial. It's the upper one that holds the door on, because the lower one can just rest on the ground. It's the upper hinge that stops the whole door falling over. So the Mishnah says, Machzirin siratachton b'mikdash. We can replace the lower hinge in the temple, aval lo v'amida, but not in the country. V'ha'elyon kan v'chan asur. And the upper one is forbidden in both places. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to come and disagree. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ha'elyon b'mikdash v'atachton b'medina. Rabbi Yehuda will say, look, this is just a rabbinic prohibition. And rabbinic prohibitions don't apply in the Mikdash. So even the upper one can be replaced in the temple. And the lower one, okay, we wouldn't, the lower one can be replaced in the country, even though the upper one is going to be still forbidden in the country.
Benedict, in the country, does that mean in general, in life, in places other than Beit HaMikdash?
That means anywhere outside the Beit Mikdash. That means anywhere outside the Beit Mikdash, including, for that matter, in Jerusalem.
Good.
So we're just talking about the suspension of rabbinic prohibitions in the temple, just in the temple. And now we're going to leave the question of bolts and hinges and doors completely. And now we're going to get into a general question of stuff that we do in the temple and not in the country. So, Machzirin retiya v'mikdash. A retiya is a bandage, it's a plaster. Generally, by the way, it'll have some kind of poultice underneath it, which will be made by grinding up herbs. So that there will be medicine in the poultice, but not in the plaster. Machzirin retiya v'mikdash. We can replace a bandage in the temple, aval lo v'amedina, but not in the country. And a priest might need a bandage on his hand in order to serve in the temple. So we're dealing here with activities which are needed for the temple service. So that's why the priest might put a bandage on. But the Mishnah says, im batchila, if this is the first time we put the bandage on, im batchila, kan v'chan asur. It's forbidden in both places. The first time we put on the bandage, we are going to prepare the poultice underneath it. We're going to prepare medicine. And that really is an Isur Doraita. So we wouldn't do that even in the temple. And along the same lines, koshrin nima, one might tie a harp string in the temple, v'amikdash. We might tie up a harp string in the temple, aval lo v'amida, but not in the country. Because we play music in the temple, even on Shabbat. Until the destruction, we played music in the temple on Shabbat. The Levi'im used to play instruments to go with the singing. We'll find out in the Mishnah Pesachim as we get into it, that actually the original Hallel was on Erev Pesach. I hope we'll touch that Mishnah before Pesach. They played instruments in the Beit Mikdash, but of course on Shabbat you wouldn't fix a musical instrument on Shabbat. Im batchila kan v'chan asur. if for the first time it's prohibited in both, I guess this must be setting up the musical instrument for the first time. Chotchin yabelet b'mikdash, we can cut off a wart in the temple. Aval lo v'avnida, why would you want to cut off a wart? Well, if a priest is blemished, if his hands are disfigured, he can't serve. So for the purpose of temple service, we might want to cut off a wart on Shabbat. Chotchin yabelet b'mikdash, we might cut off a wart in the temple, aval lo v'avnida, but not in the country. This Mishnah, is it's like poetry, right? This Mishnah, the three verses replicate one another. Ve'im bichli kan v'chan asur. But if we're going to cut it off with an instrument, kan v'chan asur, it's forbidden in both places, again, because this looks like real surgery.